Act 1. The Boy from Elk Hollow. In the narrow crease of the Delaware Valley, where fog clings to the birch trees and the river murmurs secrets to the stones, a boy named Elijah Harper was born to no renown. His family tilled bitter soil and ferried news between rebel sympathizers, a lineage of quiet defiance more ancient than any king's decree. His father had once whispered with John Dickinson and passed notes, sewn into saddle linings. His mother taught letters to children in the barn behind their home when the British outlawed such gatherings. But by the winter of 1777, their world had changed. The Crown's boots had crushed the laughter out of villages like Elk Hollow. Tithes grew cruel. Neighbors disappeared. Redcoat patrols skulked down orchard rows at dusk. The American rebellion was no longer distant thunder, it was clawing at their doors. Elijah was 12 the first time he saw a man shot for refusing to quarter soldiers. He never forgot the sound. By 16, Elijah knew the routes of every courier from the Delaware to Princeton, knew which trees bent suspiciously, where hoofprints lingered, and how to read the wind like a coded letter. He had never held a musket in open battle. But he had burned maps from Loyalist caches, slipped forged letters into British mailbags, spied from hollowed-out haystacks. And no one suspected the quiet boy with soot-smudged hands and a downcast gaze. It wasn't until the Crown placed a bounty, £10 sterling, on the unknown saboteur of Mercer County, that whispers began. Someone was unweaving the British grip with nothing but ink, flint, and nerve. His parents tried to shield him, warned him of what men become when cornered by empire. But Elijah had already made his peace. He wasn't chasing glory. He wasn't even chasing victory. He was chasing time, buying a few more weeks for the hidden rebels in Cranberry. A few more days for the ammunition to reach Washington's men. A few more hours for a schoolteacher to finish her last lesson before the news came. Elijah Harper, son of farmers, born beneath a moonless sky, was becoming a ghost among soldiers. A flicker in the trees. A rumor. A problem. And problems, as the British soon learned, are hardest to catch when they wear no uniform and answer to no name. Act 2. Ashes beneath the laurel. The village of Cranberry slept beneath a veil of frost, its chimneys trailing thin ribbons of smoke into the morning haze. But beneath its tranquil surface stirred unrest. British troops had tightened their grip, patrolling nearby roads and interrogating travelers. Rumors of collaborators moved like poison through the tavern whispers, and trust grew brittle as glass. Elijah Harper stood barefoot in the barn loft, watching the dawn through slats in the wood. In his hand he held a strip of parchment, smudged with charcoal markings, coded and folded twice over. The message had come by way of a wandering tinker who'd left more than trinkets behind. It was a warning. A Loyalist informant had exposed a rebel safehouse near Millstone Creek. There was no hesitation in Elijah's movements. Within minutes he was lacing his boots and strapping the knife to his belt. The woods knew him as one of their own. He would reach the safehouse before the British did, or not at all. The trail was slick and silent. Pine needles muffled his steps. Twice he froze, watching redcoats march along wagon-rutted roads, their muskets slung low, eyes scanning the tree line. But they never saw him. Elijah moved like smoke. He arrived just as the smoke curled skyward from the old mill chimney, 3 spirals in sequence, the sign that someone was inside. He crept through the brush and saw them, 2 men and a woman, faces taut with fear, rifles half cleaned on the table. Patriots in hiding. He tapped the pane once, twice. Their faces turned, and relief softened their expressions. Elijah gave them no time for questions. They fled into the timber moments before the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the ridge. Elijah stayed behind. By the time the British reached the mill, all they found were coals in the fireplace and a single feather in the threshold, black as night. The boy had vanished. Back in Cranberry, beneath the floorboards of the old blacksmith's shed, Elijah lay on his stomach, listening through the cracks as boots stomped overhead. He wasn't a soldier. Not yet. But war doesn't wait for age to grant permission. And the boy was already fighting in its shadows. Act 3. Ash and Echoes. The Harper homestead stood at the edge of a brittle field, where frost curled at the edges of last year's crops, and the chimney spat a thin trail of smoke into the pale morning sky. It was a modest place, wooden, weathered, and stubbornly upright, but in recent days it had become more than a home. It had become a front line. Inside, Elijah moved between shadows like a seasoned sentinel, not a boy of 14. His mother, Abigail, stitched a torn sleeve with hands roughened by labor, eyes flicking to the door with each gust of wind. They were both used to listening, to the creak of timber, the snap of twigs, the quiet signals of something coming. And something was coming. 2 nights prior, a message had arrived hidden inside a hollowed-out bone-handled brush. A detachment of Loyalist enforcers had raided a rebel hideout near Crosswicks Creek. Survivors were few. A name was whispered among the dying, Elijah Harper. He had become a target. But the Harper family was not the kind to flee. By lantern light, Elijah and his mother prepared. They sealed away documents, sketched maps from memory, and packed rations into burlap sacks. By candle's end, a false floorboard beneath the hearth cradled a cache of rebel intelligence, routes, names, safe houses, treasures worth more than gold to either side. The next day passed like a held breath. Then came dusk, and with it, fire. From the treeline, they saw torches. 3 riders. The glow on their faces flickered like devils come to collect a soul. Elijah didn't hesitate. He led his mother through the back of the house and into the brush. Behind them, flames licked the eaves. The homestead cracked and moaned like a dying beast. Smoke chased them like a curse, but they did not stop. They didn't look back. They ran into the arms of the forest, into a night without stars. And as the fire consumed the only home he had ever known, Elijah Harper swore a silent oath. He would not run again. He would resist, in silence, in shadow, and in flame. Act 4. The River Knows. The river was colder than Elijah remembered. He stood knee-deep in the shallows, the dawn mist curling around his legs like the ghosts of patriots lost. Beside him, Samuel Dre, a wiry man with a crooked nose and the scent of gunpowder clinging to his coat, tightened the laces on a canvas-wrapped bundle. "Keep it above the waterline," Samuel muttered, nodding at the package. "If that map gets wet, we're as good as ghosts ourselves." Elijah nodded. In his arms, he held the most dangerous thing he'd ever touched, not a weapon, but a tangle of rebel routes, encrypted messages, and a ledger of names, farmers, printers, midwives, blacksmiths, all of them part of the quiet web of resistance stretching from the Delaware to the Hudson. The plan was simple: cross the river under the morning fog, hike the ridge trail north, and deliver the bundle to a courier waiting near a broken bell tower in Hopewell. Simple, but deadly. A Tory patrol had been spotted near the ferry ruins just yesterday. No uniforms, just men with muskets and dead eyes who shot first and took names off corpses later. By mid-morning, Elijah and Samuel were crouched beneath the skeletal remains of an old bridge, breath shallow, ears tuned to every twig crack. "They won't expect kids," Samuel whispered. "But they don't care either. You die all the same." Elijah didn't flinch. He had stopped thinking of himself as a child the night the house burned. The crossing began with silence, but it did not stay that way. Halfway across, a shout rang out. Then a shot. Samuel staggered. Blood bloomed against his ribs like spilled ink. "Go!" he hissed, thrusting the bundle at Elijah with trembling hands. "Get it to Hopewell!" Elijah didn't argue. He ran. Branches tore at his clothes. The river's mud sucked at his boots. Behind him, more shots, and then nothing but the pounding of his own heart. Hours passed. At dusk, he crawled into the bell tower, cradling the bundle to his chest like a newborn. The courier, a freckled woman with a calm voice and a surgeon's precision, took it without a word. She glanced at the blood on Elijah's sleeve but said nothing. The ledger was safe. The lines would hold. The web would tighten. Samuel would not be remembered in song. There would be no statue. But the revolution had moved 1 inch forward. And Elijah Harper had become something new, a courier of fire, running on torn feet and cold resolve. He had become the river, swift and unseen. And the river knew. Act V. Whispers beneath the gallows. The rains came that night as if summoned by some invisible sorrow hanging over the village of Ashbrook. The sky cracked with thunder, low and rolling like cannon fire on distant shores. Elijah Harper sat hunched beneath the eaves of an abandoned grist mill, watching lanterns sway through the wet darkness as British patrols combed the countryside. He had no dry clothes, no rations left, and little more than resolve keeping him warm. His mission, still unfinished, was now steeped in danger. The coded message hidden beneath the false sole of his boot outlined a British operation soon to unfold, a sweep of suspected rebel sympathizers in the outlying hamlets. A trap, thinly disguised as a disarmament campaign, intended to gut the civilian resistance. Word needed to reach the township of Cedar Hollow before dawn. But the bridges had been burned, literally. The nearest crossing now was guarded by redcoats, and every trail in between had been soaked in risk. He weighed his options, then stood. Elijah had always known fear intimately, as a child walking alone between settlements with bread for his neighbors or listening to British officers bark orders outside his window. But he learned early not to let fear steer his choices. Tonight would be no different. By midnight he had circled north through the marshes, where no regular soldier dared walk after sunset. The wind whipped at the reeds and tugged at his coat like desperate hands, and once he plunged thigh-deep into brackish water, nearly losing the message altogether. But he reached the western slope by first light, the burning in his calves matched only by the raw cold of dawn. In Cedar Hollow, a widow named Abigail Stone answered her door with a flintlock aimed squarely at his chest. "I don't talk to boys who smell like the swamp," she muttered. "I bring warning," Elijah said, handing her the message with shaking fingers. She read it slowly, then twice. Her stern face never softened, but when she turned to call her son from the fields, Elijah knew the village would be ready. The next day, as the redcoats arrived, they found empty houses, locked doors, and not a musket in sight. The people of Cedar Hollow had vanished into the hills, prepared for resistance. Elijah watched from above, hidden beneath a veil of cedar branches. He didn't feel triumph, only the pulsing truth that every small act mattered. But the British were not blind forever. 2 days later, a rider brought word: a man named Caleb Brinton, a fellow courier, had been captured just south of Millbury. Under duress, he may have revealed names. Elijah's own name. The redcoats were scouring the region for a boy ghost, who moved through walls and vanished into woodlands. It wasn't long before they came to Ashbrook. At the gallows square, they posted a notice, a reward for Elijah Harper, dead or alive. But none in Ashbrook spoke. Not even the innkeeper who had once patched up Elijah's bleeding hand. Not even the blacksmith who'd seen him steal iron nails for coded markings. Silence, even under threat, became a form of vengeance. Elijah read the notice himself under cloak of night, the ink still wet on the parchment. The noose above the platform swayed gently in the breeze. It looked freshly tied. He could have fled. Escaped north. Taken a new name in the Green Mountains and lived out his days. But his fight wasn't over. Instead, he disappeared into the woods again, not as a fugitive, but as a flame carried low beneath the wind. A whisper that moved from hearth to hearth. A name spoken only when the shutters were drawn. In every village that resisted, there were signs, 3 stones stacked on a doorstep. A red ribbon tied to a lantern. A mark on a fence post. They called them Harper's signs. None admitted to knowing what they meant, but each who saw them understood. The fight was still alive. Act 6, Beneath the Cypress Veil. By late autumn, the forest began to darken early, the light dying behind layers of moss-draped cypress. The marshland around Harper's homestead had thickened with decay and shadow, a veil of stillness broken only by the rustling of birds disturbed by unseen movements. For Elijah Harper, This twilight was both cloak and crucible. The British presence had grown bolder in the region. Major Rowan, frustrated by the elusive acts of sabotage, had dispatched his dragoons deeper into Carolina's backcountry with orders to break the spine of local resistance. Elijah knew they would find nothing at his homestead. It had long since been stripped of identifying marks and left to rot under fallen timbers and creeping vine. But the woods surrounding it were another matter. Within those woods, beneath the soft earth and the roots of elder trees, lay his web of resistance. Hidden caches of gunpowder, rebel correspondents, and even deserters spirited from their redcoat regiments all found temporary refuge in the winding hollows Harper had mapped in his mind. The forest had become a living ledger of his cause, each tree a landmark, each gully a potential redoubt. But with increased patrols came risk. On a moonless night in early November, Elijah crept along a tributary of the Black River to meet Sarah Bellamy, the merchant's daughter who had become his most unlikely confidant. She had been slipping him British reports stolen from her father's trade house, often copying troop movements and supply manifests by candlelight, her hands trembling but resolute. That night, she brought news that chilled his marrow. "They've caught someone," she whispered, eyes darting toward the thickets behind them. "A courier from Charleston. Young. 17, maybe. They think he knows who's behind the fires in Camden." Elijah's jaw clenched. He knew the boy, Thomas Frayne, barely grown and still rosy-cheeked from boyhood. Elijah had trained him in the art of silence, in the movements of the wild that allowed a man to vanish in plain sight. If Thomas had been taken. Sarah pressed a parchment into Elijah's hand. "Rowan's sending for a military tribunal. Public trial. A hanging." He didn't speak. Didn't have to. Within a day, the forest began to breathe faster. Runners were dispatched by foot and by canoe. Ciphers burned in lanterns. Families who had only ever whispered their defiance now opened barns to fugitives, passed weapons through baskets of eggs, and boiled ink to draft false rosters. The Harper ring, never named aloud, had awakened fully. The rescue of Thomas Frayne was impossible, and yet Elijah began to plan it. By torchlight, in the ruins of an old Huguenot chapel overtaken by ivy, he laid out his scheme to 3 allies: Jonah Beck, a former enslaved man turned saboteur; Ruth Summers, a widowed midwife who'd once gutted a British soldier with his own bayonet; and Abel Carter, a lame carpenter who knew the inner workings of British gallows better than their engineers. "We strike before dawn," Elijah murmured. "Not for revenge. Not for fire. For the boy. He will not be their spectacle." Silence answered. Then nods. The plan required a phantom's grace: fire along the perimeter of the British camp near Snow's Hill to draw attention, a riderless horse rigged to stampede past the main gates, and a narrow, flooded canal along which Elijah and Jonah would slip beneath the outer fencing, dragging their bodies through the mud like eels. The night of the rescue was thick with fog. The burning barn did its part, drawing redcoats in confusion toward the smoke. The horse, its reins soaked in pitch, bolted into the clearing, drawing shouts and musket fire. Elijah and Jonah emerged from the ditch like revenants, caked in grime. They found Thomas shackled to a stake, lashes torn into his back. His eyes fluttered open when Elijah pressed a hand over his mouth. "Quiet, boy. You're going home." The extraction was chaos, but organized chaos. Ruth met them with a stolen wagon draped in funeral linens. Abel's smoke bombs clouded the road. By the time Rowan's men returned, the boy was gone, and the gallows stood empty in the pale morning mist. News of the rescue rippled across the countryside, a ghost's whisper carried on wind and well water. Where fear had once pinned down the hearts of farmers and smiths, now there rose something else: belief. Elijah Harper's name remained unspoken. But the Candlemen, as some had begun calling the unseen saboteurs who lit fires in the night, were no longer myth. They were flesh and breath. And their resolve, like the cypress trees beneath which they hid, would not bend easily. Act 7. Shadows over the Hudson. The Hudson River lay wide and restless beneath a thin veil of mist, its currents whispering of distant lands and battles yet unseen. On its eastern bank, in the sleepy hamlet of Cold Spring, Elijah Harper crouched low in the shadows of a crumbling stone wall. His breath curled in the chill night air, and every sound, from the creak of the trees to the faint lapping of water, seemed amplified in the tense silence. The village had been quiet for weeks, too quiet. British-supplied barges had stopped appearing on their usual route upriver, replaced instead by swift, heavily guarded sloops. Rumor was that the Crown had grown suspicious of stolen goods and intercepted messages. Elijah knew the truth. It was because of the work of the Shadowfire Circle, a loose band of farmers, fishermen, and widows who had made the river their silent weapon. Tonight, the stakes were higher. Word had come from a courier out of West Point that a British convoy carrying winter uniforms, gunpowder, and precious salt pork would be making its way north under cover of darkness. If that shipment made it to their garrisons in Albany, hundreds more redcoats would be ready to march come spring. Elijah's orders were clear: intercept and destroy the cargo without revealing their full strength. The challenge lay in striking with precision and vanishing before the enemy could realize the scale of their resistance. He shifted in the dark, eyes fixed on the distant glow of lanterns bobbing on the river. Beside him, Anna Price, the widow-turned-smuggler whose flatboat had ferried countless rebel spies, adjusted the flintlock at her side. "We only get one chance," she whispered. "Miss, and they'll tighten security all the way to Canada." A signal light blinked twice from the far shore. Silas Cobb's way of saying the channel was clear. Elijah responded with a single flicker of his own lantern, then melted into the reeds. Every step down toward the riverbank was a careful negotiation between speed and silence. By the time the convoy came into view, 3 sloops and a smaller tender riding low in the water from their heavy load, Elijah and his small team were already in position. They would strike from both banks, a crossfire of muskets, and the sudden roar of small cannon hidden in the underbrush. The first volley erupted like thunder, splintering the night. Lantern glass shattered, shouts echoed, and the lead sloop veered sharply toward the eastern shore. Anna's flatboat slid out from a hidden inlet, blocking its path. Muskets cracked again, and Elijah caught sight of British Marines scrambling to return fire. "Now!" Elijah barked. A keg of black powder, rigged with a slow match, bobbed in the current toward the convoy. One spark later, the river itself seemed to heave as an orange bloom lit the mist. The blast staggered the sloops, ripping one's mainsail and spilling crates of supplies into the churning water. Shouts of confusion carried over the water, but Elijah and his crew were already fading back into the night, dragging what supplies they could salvage into the woods. By dawn, the British would find only charred debris and an empty shoreline. As the first pale light of morning touched the Hudson, Elijah stood atop a bluff, gazing down at the drifting wreckage. His hands were numb from the cold, but his resolve had never burned hotter. Every strike like this delayed the enemy's plans, and every delay bought the revolution another breath. And he knew the Shadowfire Circle was far from finished. Act 8: The Bitter Envoy. Snow fell in steady silence over the Hudson Valley, blanketing the frozen ground in a brittle crust that cracked beneath every step. Elijah Harper trudged along a narrow deer path, the hood of his tattered cloak drawn low against the biting wind. Ahead, the dim lantern glow of a solitary cabin flickered through the trees. Inside that cabin waited Jonas Wexler, a name whispered among patriots for his skill in forging British orders so perfect they could turn enemy regiments on each other. But tonight's meeting was more than a simple exchange of counterfeit papers. Elijah had come seeking intelligence on a rumored British envoy traveling under disguise, bound for the Highlands with promises of gold for any militia captain willing to change sides. Wexler greeted him with a firm handshake, the warmth of the hearth doing little to soften the tension in the room. "I've seen the man," Wexler said, pulling a damp wool blanket from his shoulders. "Calls himself Mr. Gray, but the cut of his coat, the way he carries himself, he's no merchant. The gold he offers is real, and some are listening." Elijah's jaw tightened. The revolution had many enemies, but few more dangerous than treachery from within. If Gray succeeded in swaying even a handful of local captains, British control could tighten across the valley like a winter frost. "I'll find him," Elijah said, "but I can't do it alone." Wexler's eyes darted toward a side room, where a young woman stepped forward, her musket slung over one shoulder. "My daughter, Rebecca. She's been tracking him since Kingston. Knows his route, his habits, and where he likes to sleep." Rebecca spoke without hesitation. "He spends the night in outlying inns, always choosing a room with a rear door. Travels with a single chest, heavy enough it takes 2 men to lift. If you want him, you'll have to move before he reaches Fishkill. Once he's there, he'll be under heavy guard." The plan formed quickly. Elijah and Rebecca would ride ahead, intercept the envoy at a lonely inn along the post road, and quietly remove both the man and his gold before dawn. The trick was to do it without sparking rumors that might make other Loyalist sympathizers tighten their guard. By midnight, the pair had taken position in the stable loft of the Black Hart Inn, their breath pluming in the frigid air. Below, Mr. Gray arrived, tall, broad-shouldered, his powdered wig neatly tied despite the snow. 2 men carried his chest up the stairs, their boots thudding heavily on the wooden boards. When the inn quieted and the fire downstairs burned low, Elijah and Rebecca moved. They slipped into Gray's room like shadows, Rebecca's musket trained on the envoy while Elijah pried open the chest. Inside, neatly stacked coins gleamed in the dim candlelight, enough to buy not just loyalty, but betrayal on a grand scale. Gray's eyes narrowed, but he didn't speak until Elijah had bound his hands. "You think this gold is the enemy?" he said coldly. "Men fight for whoever keeps their families fed." "Then it's a good thing," Elijah replied, "that we fight to keep them free." By dawn, Gray was gone, escorted south under Patriot guard, and the gold, divided into smaller sacks, was already on its way to supply desperate militia units in the hills. The snow-covered road lay empty once more, but the war for men's hearts and loyalties had only grown fiercer. Elijah knew their victory that night was fragile, a single ember in a storm, and it would take 1,000 more to keep the fire alive. Act 9. The River's Whisper. The Hudson lay still beneath a pale winter sun, its surface glazed with thin ice that cracked and shifted with the faintest movement of the tide. Elijah Harper stood on the riverbank near New Windsor, his breath hanging in the air, eyes scanning the opposite shore. Somewhere across that wide expanse, British scouts were moving, unseen, unheard, yet dangerously close. The previous night's mission with Rebecca had earned him a rare few hours of rest, but Wexler's urgent messenger had found him before dawn. A string of coded dispatches, intercepted near the river, hinted at a planned crossing. The British weren't coming in force. This was subtler, more surgical. Couriers, perhaps. Or spies. Either way, it was enough to unravel weeks of Patriot maneuvering if they slipped through. Elijah crouched low in the tall reeds, his gloved fingers brushing the brittle stalks. The river whispered softly as chunks of ice drifted southward, breaking against the shore with hollow cracks. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening, the faint dip of an oar, the rhythmic creak of wood under strain. They were here. He melted back into the tree line, moving quickly and silently until he reached a narrow bluff where Rebecca waited with her musket. Her cheeks were flushed with cold, but her eyes were sharp. "Flatboat," she murmured. "2 men rowing. Another in the stern, cloaked." Elijah's gaze followed hers. The vessel cut a dark shape against the silver-gray ice, its progress slow but steady. The cloaked figure in the stern seemed to be looking everywhere at once, scanning for threats. Whoever he wasn't a simple boatman. A plan formed between them with no need for many words. Rebecca would move upriver, blocking their landing point with a fallen pine. Elijah would shadow them from the bluff, then strike when they were within musket range. The trap sprung in a heartbeat. The boat scraped against the hidden pine, jerking sideways. Elijah's musket thundered once, splintering the oarlock. Rebecca was already on the shore, musket leveled, shouting for them to surrender. The cloaked man did not raise his hands. Instead, he tossed something into the icy water, a small leather satchel, the splash barely audible over the chaos. Elijah's heart seized. Whatever was in that bag was the reason for this crossing. Without thinking, he plunged into the river. The cold bit like knives, the weight of his cloak dragging him down as the current clawed at him. He kicked hard, hands finding the satchel beneath a drifting slab of ice, and pushed back toward the shore. By the time he emerged, teeth chattering violently, Rebecca had the 3 men under guard. The satchel's contents were safe: a sheaf of letters sealed with crimson wax, the sigil of a British intelligence officer stamped deep into each. Back at Wexler's cabin, the seals were broken by candlelight. Inside lay maps of Patriot supply depots, lists of militia leaders, and a timetable for coordinated Loyalist uprisings along the Hudson corridor. Elijah's fingers tightened on the parchment. They had stopped one crossing, but the scale of the plan meant more would come, by river, by road, perhaps even hidden in the ranks of their own. The Hudson, calm now in the moonlight, seemed to whisper a warning he could almost hear. The enemy is already among you. Act X, the Winter of Ashes. The winter winds carved through the valley like invisible scythes, slicing at the faces of those who dared the roads. Snow lay in jagged drifts against the skeletal remains of stone walls, and the once bustling hamlets along the Hudson had fallen silent, their chimneys cold from lack of fuel. It was in this season, when armies retreated into barracks and even raiders hesitated to ride, that Elijah Harper found the truest tests of courage. In the village of Broad Hollow, a place barely more than a crossroads, word had spread of a hidden Patriot courier network still ferrying intelligence south toward Washington's encampment. The British, frustrated at the loss of several foraging parties to sudden ambushes, had sent their most ruthless officer, Captain Silas Dray, to root out the resistance. His reputation was one of fire and gallows. Where Dray rode, houses burned, and survivors were left to tell the tale. Elijah, cloaked in rough homespun and moving under the name Jonas Clay, arrived on a night when the moon was a pale smear behind thick clouds. He carried no musket, only a length of rope, a dagger, and the knowledge of hidden trails that even locals had forgotten. His task was simple in words and treacherous in deed: evacuate the couriers before Dray's men found them. The first house, a widow's cottage at the edge of the wood, was marked by a single candle in the window, flickering against the cold. Inside, Mary Weaver, scarcely 20, was binding small packets of parchment with twine. "They're already close," she whispered. Elijah didn't waste words. Together they doused the candle, hid the packets in a hollow beneath the hearthstones, and slipped into the woods. Snow muffled their footfalls, but the jangle of bridles and the crunch of boots on frozen earth soon drifted through the trees. Dray's men moved in a column, torches swaying. Elijah led Mary down a deer path that twisted like a serpent, using the dark to swallow their shapes. Behind them, the torchlight spread. Dray was splitting his forces to comb the forest. By dawn, they had gathered 4 couriers, 2 young men, a middle-aged schoolmaster, and Mary. Elijah took them to an abandoned cider mill whose wheel was locked in ice. From there, they would be smuggled by sled to a safe farmstead 10 miles south. But as they prepared to move, a distant crack rang out: musket fire. One of the scouts had found their trail. Elijah stepped into the open snow, drawing the enemy toward himself. He moved deliberately, letting them catch glimpses of his form between the trees before disappearing again. For 2 hours he played this game, weaving a trail deep into the forest, until the courier's sled was far beyond danger. When he finally circled back to the mill, the only sign of his passing was a single print in the snow where he had paused to watch the sled vanish over the ridge. Broad Hollow would burn that winter, Dray saw to that. But the network survived, its lifeline of messages unbroken. And in the whispered stories of the survivors, there was talk of a shadow in the woods, a man who drew fire and vanished into snow, whose name none dared speak aloud. Act 11, The Flames of Hope. The first light of dawn painted the horizon a bruised purple as Elijah Harper stood atop the ridge overlooking the town of Kingston. The chill air bit through his worn coat, but his eyes were fixed on the distant spires and chimneys, smoke curling gently into the pale sky. Despite the cold, a quiet fire burned in his chest, a hope that the revolution was still alive in every whispered plan, every stolen letter, every flicker of resistance. Months of careful sabotage and secret meetings had taken their toll on the British presence. Supplies were dwindling, morale fraying. But the enemy adapted swiftly, tightening patrols and imposing harsher punishments on suspected rebels. Elijah knew the path ahead would only grow darker. Yet, even in the face of increasing danger, the Candleman's flame endured. In the early hours, Elijah met with Jonah Beck and Ruth Summers beneath the shelter of a withered elm. They discussed the next phase, disrupting a major British supply caravan scheduled to pass through the winding roads of the Catskills. Success here would delay reinforcements and buy precious time for the Continental forces. The plan was daring: to block narrow mountain passes with felled trees, create controlled fires to obscure vision, and then strike swiftly with muskets and hand-thrown grenades. Precision and timing would be everything. As night fell, Elijah moved through the shadows with practiced stealth. The sounds of the forest wrapped around him, the snap of twigs, the rustle of leaves, all carefully orchestrated as he positioned his comrades along the planned ambush sites. When the British caravan finally appeared, it was met with chaos. Trees crashed down, blocking the path. Flames rose, casting an eerie glow over the panic-stricken soldiers. Rebel fire was relentless and precise. By dawn, the supply line was broken. Elijah and his band melted back into the wilderness, leaving behind a battlefield that whispered of rebellion and resilience. Standing once more on the ridge, Elijah allowed himself a brief smile. The road was long, the cost steep, but the hope for freedom burned brighter than ever. Act 12, The Silent Vigil. Winter's grip tightened across the Hudson Valley, blanketing the forests and fields in snow that seemed to swallow sound itself. Elijah Harper and his closest allies took refuge in the hollowed remains of an old mill, its roof long since collapsed but its stone walls offering some shelter from the biting cold. The war had slowed with the season, but danger was no less present. British patrols scoured the region with renewed zeal, seeking any sign of the elusive Candlemen who had become a thorn in their side. Elijah knew that every day above ground was a risk. Every fire they kindled could lead to their undoing. Within the quiet, they planned their next moves, poring over maps marked with routes, safe houses, and enemy positions. Outside, the wind howled like a warning, rattling the skeletal branches of the trees. That night, Elijah stood watch beneath a sky heavy with stars, the weight of the coming months pressing down on him. He reflected on the sacrifices made, the friends lost, the families torn apart, but also on the flickering hope that kept the fight alive. The Candlemen were no longer just shadows, they were a promise. A silent vigil against tyranny. Act 13, The Turning Tide. Spring crept back into the Hudson Valley with hesitant steps, melting the snow and coaxing life from frozen earth. Along the winding trails and hidden clearings, Elijah Harper and the Candlemen felt the shift, not just in season, but in the war itself. News from the Continental Army spoke of small victories and mounting pressure on British forces. Yet the enemy remained dangerous, their reprisals brutal and unforgiving. Elijah knew that their work was far from over. The Candlemen would need to strike harder, faster, and with greater cunning to support the swelling tide of revolution. Together with Ruth Summers and Jonah Beck, Elijah mapped out raids on British outposts, targeting supply caches and communication lines. Each success weakened the Crown's grasp, each setback forged their resolve. As flowers bloomed along the riverbanks, the rebels moved like ghosts, silent, unseen, unstoppable. Act 14, The Crossroads of Fate. The battle for the soul of the Hudson Valley had reached a critical point. British forces, frustrated by constant guerrilla attacks, began fortifying key towns and roads, erecting barricades and increasing patrols. Elijah Harper faced a difficult choice: strike at a heavily defended depot and risk the lives of his comrades, or retreat and preserve the fragile network that kept the rebellion alive. Gathered around a flickering candle in a cramped safe house, the Candlemen debated their options. Ruth's voice was steady, advocating for patience and precision, while Jonah argued for bold action that could turn the tide. In the end, Elijah made the call that weighed heaviest on a leader's heart: they would attack. The night of the assault was thick with tension. Shadows moved like phantoms through the trees, and every heartbeat thundered in Elijah's ears. When muskets fired and the first flames ignited, there was no turning back. Act 15. The Price of Freedom. The aftermath of the attack left the valley scarred but hopeful. British troops, caught off guard, retreated with heavy losses, their supply lines in tatters. Yet victory came at a grave cost. Among the fallen was Abel Carter, a steadfast friend and one of Elijah's earliest allies. His sacrifice cast a long shadow over the Candlemen's ranks, a painful reminder that freedom demanded more than courage, it demanded sacrifice. Elijah stood over the freshly turned earth, the bitter wind carrying whispers of promises made and debts unpaid. He vowed that no loss would be in vain. The war raged on, and with every heartbeat, the Candlemen's resolve grew fiercer. Their fight was no longer just for survival. It was for a future where their children could live without fear. Act 16. The Gathering Storm. Spring's thaw brought a restless energy to the Hudson Valley. As the Candlemen regrouped, reports of British reinforcements and harsh reprisals trickled in like thunderclouds on the horizon. Elijah Harper knew the coming weeks would test their endurance more than any battle yet. In secret meetings beneath the canopy of ancient pines, plans were drawn for a coordinated strike, one that would not only disrupt the enemy's hold but inspire hope across the colonies. Allies from distant towns pledged their support, swelling the ranks of the resistance. Yet even as alliances formed, spies and traitors lurked among them, shadows within shadows. Trust became a precious commodity. Elijah's gaze hardened. The path ahead was perilous, but the flame of liberty burned brighter than ever. Act 17. Ashes in the Wind. The raid on the British supply train began under a moonless sky, the world reduced to shades of black and silver. Elijah and his small band crept along the ridgeline, every step muffled by damp earth. Below them, the enemy wagons creaked along the narrow pass, lanterns swaying like distant fireflies. At his signal, the Candlemen descended, swift, silent, merciless. Powder kegs were rolled into the ditches, wheels splintered beneath axe blows. The air filled with the scent of burning canvas as flames devoured precious food and ammunition. The British Guard fought fiercely, steel flashing in the gloom, but the surprise had been total. By the time reinforcements arrived, the convoy was nothing but smoldering wreckage. As dawn broke, smoke curled into the pale sky, drifting eastward. Villagers awoke to see the black columns and whispered the name of the Candlemen like a prayer. Act 18. The Widow's Letter. The morning after the raid, Elijah sat in the loft of an abandoned mill, unwrapping a parcel brought by a village boy. Inside was a folded letter, edges worn from travel. It bore the seal of Widow Callahan, whose farm had once sheltered the Candlemen when they were half-starved fugitives. Her words were plain but heavy. British soldiers had raided her property, confiscating livestock and threatening to burn her home unless she revealed Elijah's location. She claimed ignorance, but the warning was clear: King's men were closing in. Elijah passed the letter around the circle of weary faces. None spoke, yet their eyes burned with a silent vow. The war was not a distant struggle for these people. It was at their doorsteps, gnawing at their livelihoods. By nightfall, a plan was set. The Candlemen would strike again, this time not just to cripple supply lines but to send a message: no reprisal would go unanswered. Act 19. Ashes in the Road. The Candlemen moved under a shroud of rain, each footstep swallowed by the sucking mud. Their target was a munitions convoy bound for a loyalist garrison upriver. The wagons, heavy with powder kegs, would pass along the old coach road before dawn. Elijah positioned his men along a choke point where the road narrowed between a crumbling stone wall and a ridge of oak trees. The plan was swift and brutal: topple the lead wagon, ignite the powder, vanish before the smoke cleared. When the creak of wheels and the clatter of hooves finally broke the night, hearts quickened. A lantern swung from the lead wagon, casting trembling light on the rain-slick stones. At Elijah's signal, 2 men heaved a felled tree into the road. The horses reared, the driver cursed, and in the chaos, sparks lit the rain. The explosion tore the night apart, fire painting the low clouds. By the time British reinforcements arrived, the road was impassable, and the candlemen were gone, leaving only the smoking wreckage and the whispered rumor that the rebels were everywhere. Act XX, The Widow's Signal. Dawn broke over the Harper farm in muted gold, the rain having given way to a brittle chill. In the barn loft, Elijah crouched beside Widow Talbot, her wrinkled hands deftly tying a strip of red cloth to the beam. To anyone passing, it was laundry. To the candlemen, it meant move now, enemy scouts inbound. The widow had lived alone since the first year of the war, her husband lost at sea, her sons taken by fever. She kept her grief close, her rifle closer, and her eyes sharper than any sentry. For years she'd carried messages under baskets of eggs, hidden cartridges and loaves of bread, and passed signals with nothing more than a flicker of lamplight in her window. This morning, the cloth told Elijah what words didn't have time to. British dragoons were sweeping the valley, searching farms, taking grain and grain bearers alike. He gathered his men and vanished into the tree line, their boots muffled on damp earth. By the time the dragoons reached the Harper farm, the widow was alone at her table, calmly mending shirts. The red cloth was gone. The riders found nothing, except a kettle whistling on the fire. Do you want me to immediately flow into Act XXI so the pace stays unbroken? Asked ChatGPT. Act XXI, the last bridge before nightfall. The creek that curled through Ash Hollow was swollen with meltwater, its banks crumbling in places where the spring floods had bitten away the soil. A single wooden bridge spanned it, a rickety thing Elijah remembered from boyhood, when he dared friends to race across without touching the rails. Now it was the only passage west before night, and the British column was less than 2 hours behind. His band worked fast. Samuel Pike, the wiry trapper, wedged powder charges between the bridge's support beams, his fingers quick as if setting snares. 2 others gathered brush from the riverbank, piling it in the middle to catch fire when the time came. Elijah crouched at the far end, scanning the tree-line for any sign of red. They didn't have to wait long. A glint of metal in the fading sun told him the vanguard was near. He signaled Pike, and the charges went off in a series of sharp cracks. The bridge buckled, then sagged into the churning water, carrying their makeshift barricade with it. The creek would run high for days, and the British would have to find another way across. By then, Elijah and his men would be miles deeper into the hills, chasing the next fight before night could catch them. Act XXI, Smoke on the Ridge. Twilight draped the hills in violet shadows, the air sharp with the promise of rain. Elijah's band had taken to a narrow ridge path that wound above the valley floor, the kind of trail only locals knew how to follow without breaking an ankle. From here, they could see the British campfires flicker in the lowlands, a scatter of orange sparks in the growing dark. They stopped just short of the ridge's crest, crouching among boulders slick with moss. Below, the enemy had settled in, unaware that a dozen pairs of eyes watched from the stones above. Elijah passed the word down the line, no rifles tonight, only smoke. From their packs came bundles of green pine needles and damp leaves bound tight. They lit them with small, careful flames, letting the wind carry the thick, acrid plumes downslope. Within minutes, the valley floor was wrapped in a choking fog. Shouts rose from below as tents collapsed in the confusion, soldiers stumbling through the haze. It wouldn't kill them, Elijah knew, but it would keep them blind and coughing through the night. By the time the smoke cleared, his men would be ghosts again, leaving only the memory of shadows on the ridge. Act XXI, The Iron Gate. By dawn, Elijah's band was already miles from the ridge, their boots slick with mud from a night march through the lowland swamps. The enemy would be furious come morning, but the work was not finished. Ahead lay the Iron Gate, a rusted, iron-barred outpost guarding the main supply road. The place was a relic from an older war, its walls crumbling but still formidable enough to delay any force without artillery. Elijah had scouted it once before and knew its weakness, a hidden culvert at the base of the north wall where the stream trickled through. Crouching in the reeds, the men stripped down to shirts, tying their rifles across their backs with rope. The water was icy as they slid into the current, moving with the slow patience of stones. The culvert was half choked with debris, but Elijah wriggled through first, the scrape of metal against his shoulders echoing in the dark. Inside, the gate's interior smelled of mildew and gun oil. A lone sentry leaned against the wall, half asleep, musket cradled in his arms. Elijah's hand clamped over the man's mouth before he could speak, dragging him silently into the shadows. One by one, the others followed, their wet boots leaving no sound on the stone. The iron gate would be theirs by sunrise, and with it, the road. Act Ziv, ashes on the road. By first light, the iron gate stood silent except for the faint creak of its hinges swaying in the wind. Elijah had posted 2 men at the parapet, while the rest set about dismantling the powder stores. A dozen casks, enough to arm a regiment, were rolled into the courtyard, their black powder glinting like fine sand in the early sun. There was no time to haul it away. They would destroy it. The fuse was improvised from a length of rope soaked in spirits, running like a pale snake toward the pile. Elijah struck the flint once, twice. On the third try, a tongue of fire licked its way down the line. He didn't watch it reach the powder. He and his men were already halfway down the slope toward the trees when the blast hit, a thunderous crack that sent a column of smoke punching into the sky. Ash rained down on the road like black snow, coating the men's hair and shoulders. That road would be impassable for days. More importantly, the enemy's next march toward the rebel heartland had just been starved of its lifeblood, supplies. Somewhere deep inside, Elijah knew this was no longer just a string of raids. It was a campaign. And every step drew him closer to the inevitable confrontation with the officer whose name he had not spoken aloud in months. Act XXV, The Whispering Oak. Night swallowed the forest whole, except for the old oak standing alone on the hill. Its branches bent low and wide, as if listening to the murmurs of the wind. This was the meeting place, there, Whispering Oak, where messengers from neighboring militias came to trade news. A rider appeared, cloaked and hooded, his horse foaming from the run. He carried no lantern, only the glint of moonlight on a folded scrap of parchment. Elijah read it once, twice, then burned it in the small fire. The message was brief: enemy columns spotted south of the river. 2 days' march. Number unknown. The firelight caught the lines of strain in Elijah's face. He knew the ground there: tight river crossings, marshy banks. Perfect for slowing a force, if you could survive their initial push. The men camped under the oak, bedrolls laid on damp leaves, the branches above creaking like an old friend murmuring warnings. Elijah lay awake long after the fire died, listening to the wind and wondering if it carried the sound of drums from the south. Act XXVI, crossing the drowned ford. The next morning they moved north along the river until the water narrowed to a ford, though ford was generous. A week of rain had swollen it into a waist-deep torrent. The bottom was slick with silt, and every step pulled at the men's legs as if the river itself wanted to keep them. Elijah crossed first, the current battering his thighs, rifle held high over his head. The others followed in single file, packs swaying. Halfway across, a log shot past, missing the lead man by inches. On the far bank, they collapsed into the wet grass, shivering but alive. The river would slow the enemy, and if Elijah's instincts were right, the delay would be just enough for them to prepare the next trap. He didn't have the luxury of certainty, only the steady burn in his chest that told him the enemy was coming, and the knowledge that, for once, the ground ahead was theirs. Act XXVI, smoke over Briar Hollow. By midday, a column of dark smoke rose beyond the tree line to the west. It wasn't from a campfire, too thick, too constant. Elijah's jaw tightened. Briar Hollow lay in that direction, a cluster of farms strung along a dirt road barely wide enough for 2 carts to pass. They reached it by late afternoon, slipping between hedgerows and leaning fences. The air was acrid, stinging the eyes. Several houses smoldered, and the sound of weeping came from behind a collapsed barn. A woman stumbled into view, her skirts singed, clutching a child against her chest. "They took the rest," she whispered. "Men in red. Said they'd burn every roof if we didn't tell them where you were." Elijah felt the guilt settle in his stomach like lead. Briar Hollow had never asked for his war, but it had found them anyway. That night, as they helped dig a trench to bury the dead livestock, Elijah made a silent vow: the men who had done this would not see another harvest. Act XXVI, The Empty Village. 2 days later, they tracked the raiders east to a small riverside village. The place was silent as a grave. Not a bird in the sky, not a single dog's bark. Doors hung open, chairs lay overturned in the street. Elijah sent men to search. They found no bodies, no sign of struggle, just absence, as if the whole town had walked into the river and vanished. In the center square, someone had carved a message into the trunk of the Liberty Tree. "Go home, or you'll follow them." The words gnawed at Elijah. This was no random terror, it was deliberate, calculated to spread fear like rot. The British were learning to fight his way, and that made them far more dangerous. Act 6, The Hunter's Gift. In the woods north of the empty village, they found him, a wiry, grizzled hunter with a musket almost as long as he was tall. He introduced himself only as Cates. Cates claimed he had shadowed the raiders for 2 days, watching them from the tree line. They had prisoners, 15 or 20 souls, being marched toward the old garrison at Fairwater Bluff. He drew a rough map in the dirt with a stick, marking every bend in the road and patch of swamp. "You can get ahead of them here," he said, pointing. "But you'll need to move like the devil's behind you." Elijah didn't hesitate. "Then we move tonight." Act XXX, The Swamp Road. The air was thick with the smell of rotting vegetation, and the ground swallowed boots to the ankle. Mosquitoes whined in clouds. Every splash of a footstep echoed too loud in Elijah's ears. They marched single file along the causeway, torches doused, following only the pale glimmer of moonlight on stagnant water. Somewhere in the dark, an alligator slid off a bank with a sound like a stone dropping into a well. Cates was right. The swamp road would get them ahead of the column. But if they slipped, the mire would take them, and no one would ever find the bones. When they finally reached dry ground, dawn was smearing the eastern sky pink and gold. Ahead, through the thin fog, Elijah saw movement, rows of prisoners stumbling between redcoats. Act XXXI, The First Shot. They waited in silence among the pines. Elijah could see the prisoners' faces now, mud-caked, hollow-eyed. One of them was the woman from Briar Hollow. Elijah raised his hand, then lowered it slowly. He took the first shot himself. The musket cracked, and a redcoat at the rear of the column pitched forward into the road. The sound echoed in the trees, followed by a second volley from his men. The British scrambled for cover, shouting, but the narrow road trapped them. Prisoners dropped flat in the mud as the firefight raged overhead. When it was done, the column lay broken, and the surviving redcoats fled toward the river, leaving the prisoners free. Act XXXI, Fairwater Bluff. Cates insisted on guiding them to Fairwater Bluff, saying the garrison there still held supplies and ammunition the enemy would come back for. The bluff rose sheer from the riverbank, topped by a stone fort whose walls glowed pale in the moonlight. They crept to its edge and looked down into the courtyard. Barrels, crates, and stacks of firewood, enough to keep the war machine turning for months. Elijah turned to his men. "We burn it." Act XXXI, Flames at Fairwater Bluff. Under cover of darkness, Elijah's band slipped past the outer guards and into the fort's shadowed courtyard. Their boots were muffled on the cold stone as they stacked barrels of powder and crates of ammunition in the center. A single spark, and the night exploded in fire. The roar of flames filled the air, crackling as they consumed wood and canvas alike. Alarms blared, and soldiers scrambled, but the rebels melted away into the forests before the garrison could mount a defense. Smoke billowed high into the sky, a beacon of defiance visible for miles. The British had lost a critical foothold, and the message was clear: the Candlemen were rising. Act XXXIV, the gathering storm. News of the raid spread like wildfire. Patriots across the valley grew bolder, swelling the ranks of the resistance. Yet, the British response was swift and brutal. Raids intensified, and loyalist militias scoured the countryside for sympathizers. Elijah and his comrades found themselves hunted more fiercely than ever. Each step forward came at a cost, but the spark of revolution refused to be extinguished. Amid the growing turmoil, new allies arrived from distant colonies, bringing fresh hope and weapons. The war, once a distant struggle, was now a firestorm engulfing the land. Act XXXV, The Lost Letter. One evening, a courier arrived with a sealed letter from General Washington himself. The note praised Elijah's efforts and urged coordination for an upcoming offensive that could turn the tide. Elijah read the letter by firelight, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. This was no longer a local fight, it was part of a grand design for liberty. With renewed resolve, the Candlemen prepared for their most daring operation yet, knowing the risks could be greater than ever. Act XXXVI, The Secret Meeting. In a hidden glen, surrounded by towering pines, Elijah met with leaders from neighboring militias. Plans were laid for simultaneous strikes on British fortifications, disrupting supply lines and communications. Maps were spread, routes marked, and signals agreed upon. The alliance was fragile but crucial. As dawn approached, Elijah felt the heavy burden of leadership, aware that the coming days would test the mettle of every rebel under his command. Act XXXVI, The Night Raid. Under a moonless sky, Elijah led a strike team to a British communications outpost. The night was thick with tension as they crept through silent woods, the only sounds their careful breaths and the rustle of leaves. In swift, coordinated moves, the rebels disabled the signal fires and destroyed messenger horses, cutting off the enemy's ability to send warnings. The mission succeeded without a shot fired, a testament to their growing skill and discipline. Act XXXVI, Betrayal in the Ranks. Rumors began to surface of a traitor within the Candlemen. Trust frayed as suspicion grew. Elijah grappled with the painful possibility that their greatest enemy might not be the Redcoats, but a friend turned informant. He set a trap, using misinformation to flush out the betrayer, knowing that the cost of failure could be the end of their rebellion. Act XXXIX, The Capture. The trap worked. One of Elijah's trusted men was caught passing secrets to the British. The betrayal shook the group, but also steeled their resolve. Elijah confronted the man in a quiet clearing, forcing a confession before sending him into exile. The incident was a harsh lesson in the cost of war and the price of loyalty. Act XL, The Final Push. With the traitor gone and alliances strengthened, Elijah and the Candlemen prepared for a decisive strike against a major British fortification. The operation required precision, courage, and sacrifice. As the battle unfolded, Elijah's leadership shone through, inspiring his men amid gunfire and smoke. Though victory came at a high cost, it marked a turning point in the struggle for freedom. Act XLI, Aftermath. The fort's fall sent shockwaves through the British command. Their grip on the Hudson Valley weakened, emboldening other rebels. Elijah and his band became legends among patriots, and a ghostly nightmare to loyalists. But the war was far from over, and the toll weighed heavily on all. Act XLI, The Farewell. With peace on the horizon, Elijah prepared to leave the fight behind. He returned to his family's farm, forever changed by the years of conflict. Though the war had taken much, it gave a new nation a chance to rise. Elijah Harper's silent valor would live on in the stories told beneath whispering oaks and starry skies.